there everyone, hope you're all doing well. So this isn't really a clickbait title. I don't really have something to put in the title like, celebrity's name like I've been doing or anything like that. But this is a topic that popped into my head this week, and it was really the only one that I was thinking of, so I wanted to give you a new perspective on it if I could. There's a recent article about the National Archives doctoring an image, and it made me think back to a lot of the times that I was taught about things in high school that weren't really emphasized at all, or emphasized in a way that made them stand out. There's a common statement out there about how the history books are written by those who win the wars. And that's really the spirit of the video that I want to kind of make today. And I want to kind of think through this topic in a way that not a lot of people do, and kind of walk through my personal experience with it. I'll go through a bit of my own personal history and how it relates to this subject, and then kind of tie that into why this relatively recent article kind of matters. So growing up, I was homeschooled, but we followed a pretty traditional curriculum, and a lot of those times I did like a co-op. Co-ops are kind of like a cooperative meeting to where a lot of people would get together. It operated similar to like a regular high school, but we kind of followed maybe like a Tuesday, Thursday schedule, or a Monday, Wednesday, Friday. So in a way, it was kind of like the combination of like a high school and a beginning college kind of experience. The teachers that I had were mostly nice, and the overall experience wasn't always my favorite, but it wasn't something that I look back and, hey, the social interactions, depending on the school that I was at, was either great or pretty poor, but it wasn't something that was like, hindering my ability to learn. I did pretty well in this school system. I breezed through most of my requirements and ended up graduating school a little bit earlier than most. And I've said this quite a few times now, but I want to reiterate that this isn't because I was smarter than anyone else in the system. I just fit really well into this group. And, the lecture format really works for me. And so, because of that, I was able to excel where a lot of people weren't able to. I'm definitely not saying that has anything to do with anybody's smarts or, how intelligent they are, because, I have a lot of creative friends that didn't do as well in school. But for me, they really show me a different kind of intelligence that I admire a lot. I'm not nearly as creative as a lot of the people that I know, and that stands out to me. Back to the topic at hand though, even though I didn't pay attention in a lot of my history classes that I had early on, the basics were definitely hammered into me. And I remember a good bit of, like the general notes of those classes. In American history, we talked a lot about Columbus Day and the Pilgrims and how they had a hard time surviving when they first came to America, how the colonists wanted independence because they were brave and charismatic, and how the valiant actions of a small few kind of changed the tide in these key movements and key wars. We learned about the Civil War and unrest, as well as how some people fought just because the states that they were in and they lived in, and how a few individuals turned the tide of the war and changed history forever. And then we were taught like people like Abraham Lincoln were out there being countercultural and believed the right thing, outside of what everybody else believed in that culture. And then we learned about World War I and World War II, and how America was reluctantly pushed into being a part of these events, and how America fought back against the tyranny and the misplaced heroism of Japan. Now, of course, there was a ton of things that we were taught, and this is definitely not all of it, but this was the general spirit of most of what we learned. And at the time, I really didn't have a framework to view what I was being told through, but I did have some questions. There were a few times that I would think back to the material that I was getting, told and taught, and wonder if I was really even being told the whole story. You see, what I began to notice, especially later on, is how watered down some of these stories were. And it seemed like there were times that they were definitely shaping the retelling, that may have specifically highlighted certain things or certain wordings to kind of maybe not mislead, but redirect some of the sympathy or the emotion of the story. There's a story out there that talks about how humans like to develop stories that fit a coherent narrative. They like to be able to look at their history and put it into one story. And so maybe some of this, wasn't intentional. It was just made so that, the story was coherent, that it made sense. But a lot of times there was like this feeling that I got that just felt wrong to me. I was confused by how simple and painless a lot of these stories sounded. I was taught about the colonial expansion and how they tried to go out into the wild, wild west. But it always seemed like there was a soft approach to the push against the Native Americans. It always seems like the light or the heroism or whatever was focused directly on the settlers and not on the Native Americans that were there and their perspective. Beyond this, in some of these books that I was reading during the early 2000s and 2010s, they would dehumanize the Native Americans and call them savages. Now, regardless of what your opinion on this idea it is, it's kind of evident that there seems to be a bit of shaping to this story. You know, on one hand, we have a group of Native Americans that's helping a certain group of people from a completely different side of the world survive and make it through winters. And we have this Thanksgiving Day, you know, that we sort of celebrate here in America. But on the other hand, we have this kind of narrative of Native Americans being savages and stuff like that. And so, you know, there is this little bit of dissonance that I could already tell was there and was kind of able to see a little bit more of growing up. The second notable thing here is that the stories many times were taught from the perspective of the people that won whatever war was being talked about. History is really a retelling of a lot of different wars and power plays and, you know, whatever was going on. And we really don't have any retellings of the colonists spreading out from the perspective of the Native Americans. And that content's certainly not included in any of the history books that I grew up reading or that I was taught through. And this pattern is definitely something that just didn't exist with this one specific example. There was definitely a lot more of this that happened. Perhaps again, it wasn't always intentional, but there were many times that the events were only presented from one side and the side was our side, the winning side, you know? And that just didn't feel right. The problem with this is that it's not that I didn't learn history, but that I didn't learn all of it. Now that I've gone through college and taken some time to do my own research, I have a much different perspective on how a lot of these events happened in the past, and I can take away so much more from these information dumps than I was ever able to in high school. There's a common saying, again, out there that history repeats itself. And that's a fair statement to make from looking at where the world has come from and where the world is. You know, there seems to be a long line of distrust that extends all the way back as far as we've recorded, and a bunch of similar people doing similar things, you know, getting similar outcomes. And the idea is that by learning history, we can get a good perspective on what went wrong so that we can fix it in the future. But to me, it seems that history is only helpful if people remember all of what went wrong and not just some of it. When only one perspective is shown, I get concerned that there's something that's being left out that could drastically change what I take away from every story and what everybody as a whole can take away from what happened. All of these events that I mentioned in the beginning have all, in some way or another, been expounded upon and reevaluated in modern times. A lot of the things that have been represented in history, you know, and curriculum that's given to schools has changed a lot, and it started to include more about both sides and what happened. But that only started because people started hearing other perspectives that weren't included in the material and had to take the time to verify and rediscover the nuance of these stories. An example of this is in the 1970s. It didn't happen through curriculum, but it happened through people for the first time being able to see what war looked like. And a lot of people weren't comfortable with what they saw and weren't comfortable with what their nation or the nation that they lived in was representing themselves as to the world. You know, and that trickled into the way that we look at, you know, wars and the history that we have. And you know, schools and writers were definitely forced to do the same research that some of these other people did and, you know, included in these books to guide specific history courses. There's a lot of reevaluation that's happened. There's a lot of people that have, you know, changed their perspectives or updated their perspectives to, you know, fit a modern, you know, understanding of what happened. And this is part of like the reason that you know, Black History Month exists. There were a lot of people that were being written out of history books based off of prejudice or just not being written about in history books. And this may have come from, you know, a head of a university or some part of the chain, but it happened. And consequently, you know, these people that did really important major things started to fade from history or the public mind. And this was a major issue, you know, because there was many amazing people out there, you know, that had done really amazing things. And it seemed an injustice that, you know, there was a bias against them just based off of what they looked like, or, you know, their skin color or their background or, you know, any various number of reasons. And, you know, this has practical problems because if people group doesn't believe that a certain part of society is benefiting society as a whole because they just haven't been taught about anything that they've done, then they may lose significance or, you know, social status inside of that culture. You know, that could be a really big issue. It comes back to these articles about the National Archives and where they intentionally blurred out words in the pictures and in some signs. You know, it's understandable why they would do something like this. They're an independent company, and in a sense, they aren't responsible for, you know, recording history exactly the way that it happened. They may want to record it in a more PG sense and blur out words that they feel uncomfortable with. But people kind of expected them, you know, as an archive, as a place to gather information, to have a little bit more integrity with the way that they represented history. And we're disappointed when they didn't maintain a kind of unbiased look at what happened. And in the end, they just removed the image from their website. They didn't actually change, the article or revert back to the original version. They just took it away. Instead of uploading the correct one, they just completely took it away. And the biggest problem I find in this whole situation is now the entire catalog that they have of history can't really be trusted. Because if they've done it just once and we caught that one time, you can almost guarantee that they've done it somewhere else and we just never have noticed it. And this is a really blatant example of what I'm talking about, but recently a lot of Native American historians have even talked about how the colonists spreading was not only unethical, but also really brutal. There's stories that, I remember hearing, recently about how Native Americans would get handed blankets as gifts from the colonists that had smallpox scrapings on them. And since they as a group of people hadn't built up a tolerance against it, that it was a massive issue, and really almost like an original version of viral warfare or chemical warfare. And then I started hearing from other retellings of history how people that I were taught about, weren't nearly as brave or as right-standing as they were portrayed to me growing up. Again, Columbus, as I mentioned earlier, is another great example of this, as he's a person who didn't really do anything or discover anything. Yet for many years we had a holiday devoted just to him, and there was positive rhetoric around what he had done, even though he really hadn't done anything. And again, this is a little bit more pointed of a story. Maybe you're not comfortable with all these conversations, but let me kind of wrap it up here at the end and kind of give reasoning to what I'm talking about. At the end of the day, history can be learned from, but we know that there are people out there that are intentionally or unintentionally rewriting it to fit either a worldview or maybe an agenda or maybe just a narrative, a coherent narrative that makes sense. And regardless of where, a person falls on a political or cultural perspective, to understand history from a balanced point of view, nowadays we may need to be able to take the time to find books from different people, from different backgrounds than the ones that we come from. History does repeat itself, but partly only because the winners generally have a larger influence at the end of the day, and what they write down as fact will probably be more remembered or have more weight than what the survivors record, of the same instance. And even if your perspective was correct all along, or, you grew up knowing the right way to look at things, this kind of pursuit, to verify what you're talking about or what you were taught will help you as well to maybe understand and verify exactly what you know about history, where it comes from, the sources that you're citing. For me, now that I know the perspective that I was taught, and I can see how I was taught information, I do my best to meet as many people as possible from as many different backgrounds as possible to see if I, through meeting them and working with them, can find a new perspective on the information that I was taught, or maybe how it's, presented, so that if I'm viewing the world in a non-correct way, I can continue to grow closer to understanding the world in a balanced, maybe communal perspective. And every time I do this, at least so far, I've gained new understanding. I've gained new insight into what's going on in the world. I've seen things from new people's perspectives and gotten new takes on world events and what's happened in history. And all of this has been really, really positive for me. And I hope this video at the end of the day is able to do something similar for you. History isn't as stable of a record as we may think it to be. But as long as we take the time to look up the original sources and talk through them with others, from the books that we're reading, and to kind of compare, what's been written down in different places, we have a better chance of actually taking away the lessons that history holds for us and their importance to today. And maybe you don't think any of this is happening. That's very possible. It could just be my personal take on this whole thing. But maybe start looking around. Like I've said before, it's always good to be able to go back and look at certain sources to take the information that you've got and figure out where it's coming from. So that way, even if you are correct, you have a better understanding of how to support what you are saying, support your arguments and discussions, and be able to kind of represent yourself to other people. That's all I've got for this video. If you have any questions, feel free to comment them down below. But besides that, hopefully we'll get back to our normal scheduled programming next week. But yeah, I'll see you guys in the next video.